Welcome to Acton, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Gabriel Jaja, producer. In this episode, Nathan Mech, Program Outreach Project Manager here at the Acton Institute, sits down with Ali Salman, co-founder of Islam and Liberty Network, to discuss his new book, Islam and Economics. Islam offers three moral principles of economic organization: ownership, wealth creation, and wealth circulation. Based on these principles, Islam and Economics derives a framework of operational institutional tenets for the economic organization of a society. It addresses all important business, policy, and equity issues that any economic system should resolve and broadens the discussion on the modern discipline of Islamic economics. You can find additional resources in the show notes of this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton on our website at acton.org/actonline. If you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify.
Hello, my name is Nathan Mech, and I'm the Program Outreach Project Manager at the Acton Institute. Today we are joined by Ali Salman, CEO of the Islam and Liberty Network and founder of the Policy Research Institute of Market Economy, Pakistan's leading free market think tank. Ali is an economist and public policy expert who has worked in government, academia, and the private sector. He formerly served as the CEO of the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs in Malaysia and is the author of the newly published book, Islam and Economics, a primer on markets, morality, and justice. Welcome, Ali.
Thank you so much, Nathan, for having me on your show.
Thank you for being here, and congratulations on the publication of your new book.
Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure and a great learning experience for me with all of you at Acton while developing this.
Yeah, and this is an important work, and I can't wait to dive into some of its themes with you here. But first, can you tell our audience what the book is about?
This book, as the title suggests, essentially explains my understanding of the concepts of economic organization as we understand from Islamic history and a reading of Islamic texts, Quran and Hadith, as well as the practices of the Prophet Muhammad and then his companions. So what I have tried to do in this book is not only a conceptual overview of certain principles of economic organization, but also I've gone further down to some operational and institutional tenets of this framework, answering questions such as what should be fiscal policy, what should be price policy or trade policy, social welfare policy in such a framework. Combining, I think, my insights from economics and Islamic history, I have tried to present this case in a very simple and accessible language, hopefully, especially to an audience in the West who may not be familiar with the background of economic development and ideas in the Islamic history.
It's fascinating how, like you said, you draw from the Quran and the teachings of Muhammad to develop an Islamic framework for business and economic policy. And I want to get into one of the topics that I found most fascinating from the book, and that was the concept of interest. And you write on the chapter you have on interest that if there's one topic that has received the most attention by writers about Islamic economics, it is charging interest on loans, because this is considered absolutely forbidden in Islam. The Quran uses the word riba for this practice and vehemently prohibits it. And then you quote the Quran, and in this translation of the Quran, the word usury is used, but that can also be translated interest. Quote, "Those that live on usury shall rise up before God like men whom Satan has demented by his touch, for they claim that trading is no different from usury, but God has permitted trading and made usury unlawful. He that has received an admonition from his Lord and mended his ways may keep his previous gains. God will be his judge. Those that turn back shall be inmates of the fire, wherein they shall abide forever. So this is a very strong condemnation of interest in the Quran. Can you tell us about what challenges this passage has posed for Muslims over the years?
Yeah, thank you, Nate, for recalling this important part of the discussion. I think, first of all, if we go back to the early Islamic history, when this challenge of riba came up, it is to be noted that it was a prevalent social practice, and particularly loans which were given to the poor people for meeting their consumption needs. They were not able to service their loans in time, and then they had to pay. They were forced to pay principal and interest many times over, and that was the practice which Prophet Muhammad and also Quran termed as riba, and forbade it eventually. It took some years. It was not done, in the beginning, but then in the very last sermon, Prophet declared that it will not be applicable anymore, and he announced that any interest or riba which was receivable by any member of my family, I forgo that. So he set a personal example. It also suggests that the key, I think, the feature of riba, at least in that society, was extreme exploitation on the basis of a loan given to the people. Now, if we come into the modern history, which I have addressed, and particularly in the evolution of the subject of Islamic economics as Islamic banking, I've noted that the initial premise of this debate in the modern era was this understanding that the Western capitalism system, the Western capitalist structure, is essentially based on savings and interest. Banking interest is the most fundamental part of this economic organization. Now, obviously, this is not correct according to what we understand from the evolution of a capitalist structure of society. We know that trade was important, entrepreneurship is important, the evolution of technology was extremely crucial. But it seems that the modern subject of Islamic economics, and particularly one of the founders, which I have addressed in the book, Maulana Maududi, one of the most influential scholar of last century, sort of simplified his understanding of economic system with the interest, and that led to actually a condemnation of the entire economic system, of which maybe the banking interest was a small part. And over the years, we saw the emergence of Islamic banking and finance on the pretext that they can come up with alternatives to riba, and that was called riba-free banking. Though interestingly, before the evolution of Islamic banks, there were Muslim banks which were established in India, in Egypt, in Turkey, in late 19th century, 20th century earlier part. And we know that they were charging interest. So I think this definition of what is riba and what was its social context and what is banking interest is something which has attracted the most scholarly attention by the Islamic economist. And I don't think it is probably one of the best uses of their intellect. I thought that there are many important topics which the economist must address, using Islamic history and examples, but and over paying attention to this subject has probably narrowed our focus too much.
The Jewish and Christian traditions have struggled with this question of usury as well. There are Old Testament verses that condemn interest. For example, there's a verse in Exodus that says, "If you lend money to any of my people who are needy among you, do not be like a moneylender to him. Do not charge him interest." So even Thomas Aquinas actually argued against the charging of interest. But today, Christians do seem more or less on the same page that interest is permissible, except, of course, if it's used dishonestly or excessively. But this is still an issue in the Muslim world today, and there are a number of different responses that Islamic economists have given to the problem. And you mentioned Islamic banks as one interesting response. And some people find the methods of Islamic banks to be moral alternatives to riba, charging interest, and others see it as a different means to the same end as riba, a distinction without a difference. Can you explain in more detail what Islamic banking is and what your view of it is?
Yes, this is extremely important. Islamic banking and finance has become quite popular, not in the Islamic world, but also in many other countries who have accepted this as part of the mainstream banking. Now, the basic premise of the evolution of Islamic banks, as they call it, was indeed riba-free banking. And the idea that in an Islamic system, we should encourage trade, and in trade, there are risks. So you can have profit and you can have loss in the trade. So, for instance, one manifestation of this distinction between riba and trade was that the banks should actually open profit and loss sharing accounts rather than interest-bearing current accounts. Right, so this was experimented in Pakistan in late 70s and early 80s. But if you go in the practice, you realize that as depositors, if I'm having an account in a profit and loss sharing account, I hardly incur a loss. There may be a variation in how much earning I am making based on the indicated profits, but then there is still some profit at the end of the year. But the name was changed from interest to profit and loss, following the spirit that Islam encourages trade and discourages riba. There were other instruments which were adopted. For instance, there was the leasing, house leasing, car leasing, which is still practiced in the Islamic banks. Were incorporated with some differences, I think. For instance, in the Islamic banks, when you are taking a house loan, you can still do it. But then the difference is that over the years, over the tenure, you're actually transferring the ownership of the asset gradually from the bank to you. And you're paying what they call a rent. So in the contract, it is mentioned you're paying a rent, and in the rent, you are gradually shifting the ownership like a shares of house. It's over 10 years. Now, if you look at the basics of it, then you realize that the fundamental point about the difference in price if an asset is bought in cash versus if an asset is bought in credit is still there. Islamic banks still acknowledge that the money, there is a time value of money. And so they have incorporated it in some ways in their transactions, in their contracts. Of course, they're not calling it riba or interest. The riba is hardly used because everyone understands it's haram. So no one would use it as far as the term is concerned. But maybe the type of transaction is still there. Although there are some differences which are important, I think these are not insignificant. For instance, when it comes to borrowing, there is explicit understanding that the underlying securities have to be physical assets. So Islamic bonds, sukuk bonds as they call it, can only be issued against a physical asset and not against monetary or non-physical asset. So Pakistani government, when it issues sukuk, it pledges any physical infrastructure which the country has developed and following this spirit. So there are these differences, but I'm saying that the key difference and the key recognition that why we need interest is the risk factors, time value of money, is still recognized in the Islamic banks.
This is such an important question because there are almost 2 billion Muslims in the world whose daily lives will be affected depending on their view of riba, of interest. And for us non-Muslims, we can maybe take for granted some of the moral considerations a Muslim has to take into account. For example, as you mentioned, do you buy a house if you have to take out a mortgage on the house because mortgages incur interest? Do you use a credit card because credit cards can incur interest? Do you open a savings account because savings accounts can earn interest? So it's interesting hearing from you about some of the ways Islamic banks have tried to come back against those problems and find ways to be profitable without charging interest. So I'm curious, do you think that those methods used by the Islamic banks are just dancing around the issue, that these are really just means to the same end? Or is there really a significant moral difference from charging interest versus using some of the methods that you described?
In essence, I believe that the Islamic banks are still charging interest, and since they are part of the economy, they cannot avoid the fact that people can enter into contract of different nature. Some people have cash available, and then they can do transactions on the basis of cash. But not everyone would be able to buy a car or a house, but they still need it. So they have come up with the alternate solutions. For instance, in Pakistan, one of the Islamic banks offers car on leasing. This is called ijara in Islamic finance terms. But they offer also, for instance, an additional insurance. Now, this is an incentive for customers to buy, but this does not necessarily mean that they have been able to avoid the element of interest which you incur when you are paying money over some years versus whatever the present value of the asset. So to a large extent, I believe that Islamic banks have created a market for Muslims who are more conscious about whether the commercial transactions are based on riba or not. So they have attracted maybe those individuals and firms which were reluctant to be a part of the financial system because that was contrary to their belief. So it is their success, but it doesn't mean that they have come up with a totally innovative financial model where they have devised a profitable model of financing without incurring interest in real terms. I hope I answer your question.
So it sounds like you think these innovative methods are a useful way for spiritually conscious Muslims to purchase a home, invest their money, etc., without infringing on riba, but that there is still a lot of similarity between these methods and the traditional ways of charging interest, and that there's not a big distinction in your view. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that will be a fair summary of my viewpoint.
Okay.
That while there have been serious scholarships and very sincere Islamic scholars have devoted their lifetime and in studying this phenomenon, coming up with this alternative, and in spirit, that I would also imagine that if, let's say, I need a loan, and if there is a company which can give me a loan on the basis of profit and loss sharing, I'll be very happy as, like, say, a borrower or as an entrepreneur, right? So this was the spirit that we will come up with mechanisms of giving you money if you want to do business, and we will become a partner in your profit if you are profitable. But if you incur loss, then that is understandable as a loss, and we will become a partner in your loss. So the concept of mudarba. So I'll be very happy as an entrepreneur, as a borrower, if such institutions really exist. But unfortunately, that is not the case. That is the spirit, but that is not the case. Islamic banks, if you go ask a loan, they would also ask for similar terms, let's say collateral or other securities, as conventional banks would do, because they are also responsible or answerable to the shareholders and central banks. So what I'm trying to say is that there is a need of such institution in that spirit. That was the whole spirit of profit and loss. But the Islamic banks have not yet discovered a model where they can provide these authentic alternatives.
I see. So there's a difference between theory and practice.
That's right. Yeah.
Their intentions are good and correct and moral, but they haven't yet figured out exactly how to accomplish what they're trying to accomplish.
That's precisely right. And one more thing is, like, although the distinction between riba and trading, as you also quoted a verse from Quran, is well established. So clearly we should distinguish the both transactions. But there is also a distinction between a relationship between riba and sadaqah. That is the charitable giving. Now, a charitable giving is meant to be reserved for those people who need loan on a compassionate grounds. They are not business people. They are not looking for loan for starting a new business, but they need a loan for their family needs, so buying something which they need for daily use. So for such people, I believe that there should be mechanisms for interest-free loans. And there are new institutions now emerging. For instance, there's a large microfinance bank in Pakistan, a microfinance institution called Akhubat, which translates as brotherhood, which has come up with the idea of interest-free lending. And they are interest-free. So they do not charge any interest while they are giving loans to small entrepreneurs. But they have to service the cost of financial operations. So since, and their model is that we can actually recover the costs of lending and financial operations from donations. So let's say they will collect $110 and they will keep $10 to meet their expenditures, and they will give out $100 and they will receive back $100. Mm-hmm. So that is an interest-free model, if you like. This was inspired by the same idea of a riba-free banking, but obviously you still have to service the costs. I think that's a good model, a socially responsible model, as compared with the frankly, conventional microfinance banks, which are actually, these microfinance banks charge much higher rate of interest than even the conventional mainstream banks because of the nature of the work. So I'm saying that there have been attempts and sincere attempts by both scholars and practitioners of Islamic finance, but to the where we are in terms of evolution of a really innovative model is still an open question.
I heard that in ancient times, the purpose of loans was seen mainly as a way to help the poor and was used less for business purposes. So interest was sometimes seen as an exploitation of the people the loans were supposed to help. So when the Bible was written, when the Quran was written, it was even the case before bankruptcy laws that people would end up in slavery if they were unable to pay back their debts. So this idea of interest-free loans seems like the simplest and most direct way to address this concern that was underlying the prohibition of interest at the time.
Yes, that's right. In fact, as we know from Islamic history also, there was a rich tradition of venture-financed trade caravans. People used to participate. It's like, through shares, and they will invest in trade caravans. They will take on the risks, but it was not a loan transaction. It was more of a participation in the business with the hope of earning profit without actually participating in the business action directly.
I see. So how would you summarize your view of riba from your book and the perspective that you offer?
So I would say that the spirit of forbidding of riba is essentially based on the fact that loans were used to exploit those who needed it for their consumption purposes, and that is something which society should be able to offer through alternative means without resorting to lending. Whereas the modern practice of banking interest, while it has some features of charging of interest, it is not exploitative in the same sense riba was considered exploitative. So I maintain a distinction between what is mentioned as riba in Quran and banking interest. But I also believe that these practices can also vary from country to country and from society to society. And the key element is that if loan is needed, then we should be able to provide it without exploitation.
So how would you advise Muslims today who want to purchase a home and are faced with the dilemma of whether or not to take out a mortgage?
I'm of the view that there is no harm in buying the house on mortgage, even with the conventional banking system or housing finance system. House ownership is a requirement, and therefore, if we do not have sufficient cash to buy, I think these assets can be acquired, and Muslims should feel that this is consistent with their belief rather than the concrete way.
And if, let's say, another Muslim challenges them on, why are you taking out this mortgage, incurring interest, what's the quick answer they can give to why that type of interest is different from the interest talked about in the Quran?
Essentially, the interest which is mentioned in the Quran is based on the social practice of exploitation and charging the interest many times over, which we do not see in modern and contemporary financial infrastructure, in which we can get a house on mortgage and then pay a very nominal amount on interest. And therefore, I do not consider this as exploitative practice and consider it acceptable.
Very interesting. So I want to turn now to a second topic that I found fascinating from your book and to be very important, and that's the chapter on taxation. I was fascinated how you built an Islamic argument for a limited government on your view of taxation. Now, most non-Muslims have some familiarity with the 5 pillars of Islam, which are the central practices of the Muslim faith. And those are the profession of faith, prayer 5 times a day, giving alms, fasting during Ramadan, and taking a pilgrimage to Mecca. And now the third one, almsgiving, and the Arabic word for that is zakat, is sometimes thought of narrowly as a purely religious obligation to give money to the poor. But you have a broader view of zakat. Can you explain to our audience what zakat means?
Yes, I think essentially zakat, I consider in a nutshell, it's a tax on those who can afford to pay. So it's not a charitable giving in a volunteer sense. For those who can afford, according to the threshold which is defined in Islamic law, they have to pay a certain percentage on their assets. And that has conventionally defined as 2.5% of their assets. But this definition has expanded, and it is understood that it also varies from sources of earning. For instance, the same tax or zakat would be 10% if you are in agriculture business, and it will be 20% if the source of revenue is based on natural resources. So there are various rates of zakat tax. Now, there are a couple of important points here. First of all, as I mentioned, this is only applicable on those people who can afford to pay and who have wealth beyond a threshold limit, which is computed on a yearly basis.
And that threshold is equivalent to around $4,000 in U.S. currency today. Is that correct?
That's right. That's about $4,000 US. It was based on originally the specific quantity of silver and gold, but in the monetary sense, that's right. Now, so first of all, there's a threshold. Secondly, the concept of charity is something which people can give on their own. It is still there, but when we talk about zakat, it is a compulsory giving. Now, in the important part of Islamic history, in early Islamic history, when these 5 pillars were being socialized in the practice of Muslim society, during the reign of the first caliph, Abu Bakr, some tribes actually announced that they will not be paying zakat. Now, there was a huge discussion on that point and whether the government of that time should the government be using force to deduct, to take zakat or not. And then it was ultimately decided that the government will actually wage a war on those tribes to collect zakat by force. Those were Muslim tribes, but who refused to pay zakat at that time. So eventually it was acknowledged that zakat is a tax, which is a low-rate tax, as you mentioned, in different rates, but then it's a part of an obligatory giving. Now, if you see that, the way I relate it with the size of the government is this, that if various sources of zakat are combined together, there is an upper limit of how much zakat can be collected. That also means that the government cannot earn revenue from any other source other than this another source I mentioned. It was a land tax, and particularly if the land is not being cultivated and developed for any purposes, that can be taken back. Yeah.
So, what is the reason for zakat, which is an annual wealth tax, and land use tax? What is the reason for those being the only two permissible taxes on Islam, in your view?
I think the main wisdom behind these two as the only taxes is that probably it was God's intent to keep the size of the government limited, and that was how it was also in a way encouraged socially, voluntary giving by society. The institution of Mech was created so that people would be able to help people themselves without resorting to the government. I think the main spirit behind the structure was to keep the size of government limited, but also one important thing that if we believe that this is part of an Islamic belief, then unlike taxes, which we legislate through Parliament, then in the future, Parliament would not be able to legislate new taxes because that's the limit which God has determined. So if there's something, for instance, Islamic prayers, okay, how many days in the holy month of Ramadan? 29 days or 30 days, so it's fixed, cannot be changed. Similar things have been fixed in terms of part of the Islamic faith. So if zakat is included is a part of similar faith structure, then I think it automatically puts a limit on what can be legislated and what cannot be legislated by our parliament. And I think that's a sort of a divine scheme to limit the revenue which state can incur.
Certainly, we think of there's so many different types of taxes that are used around the world, income taxes, sales taxes, but limiting it to just a land use tax and a wealth tax would seem to limit the revenue of a government, of course, depending on how large those rates are. But zakat, as you describe, has a maximum rate of 20%, but is usually only 2.5%. Can you explain the differences between who gets taxed 2.5% versus 20%?
So the 2.5% is normally applicable on individuals. And then I mentioned the other rates in the book. For instance, the 10% is applicable on agricultural produce. Similar rates applicable on industrial produce, and then treated in the same way. And then the 20% rate is applicable if you are, let's say, owning a mine or doing something to business extracting resources. Then the higher rate would apply, implying that there is limited amount of rent compared to, let's say, the agricultural produce. There is less of human effort involved in the natural resources, although it will require investment. But then that is how the rates are defined based on the nature of income and also the sources of.
So for most people, what they would pay is for any assets they own over $4,000 approximately in the United States, they would pay 2.5% of their assets per year.
That's right.
Plus a land use tax. And your argument is that these two types of taxes, the wealth tax and the land use tax, are the only two types of taxes with precedent in the early days of Islam. Is that correct?
This is my understanding. But let me also add something which I think would be of interest. that in the early Islamic history, the governments also waged wars, and they collected also wealth by taxing their subjects. So that was an additional source of revenue coming to the government at that time. Although there was a distinction, for instance, the lands which were in the use of subjects, particularly non-Muslim subjects, was then allowed to be, allowed in terms of the ownership. The ownership was continued against the tax bond, which is here. So there was another source of taxation when the non-Muslim subjects were included in the Islamic government or caliphate, as we call it historically. So there were other sources of income. And also, interestingly, I also like the role of tariffs. Now, historically, when in Medina, when the Prophet Muhammad established the first Muslim community, the tariff rate was kept at 0%. And he announced that there will be no tariff in my market. So anyone is welcome to bring the goods and trade. The tariff would not be charged. And even in his time, in the other markets of the same city, we know roughly about 10% of tariff was being charged. So it's like an import tax. But in the market of Muslims, there was 0% tariff. The idea was to encourage the flow of trade, not to discourage it by tariffs. But we know that later on, successive Muslim governments did introduce tariff in various percentages. So it was practice. But since my work is essentially based on the early classical practices within Islamic history, I've made this distinction in the book there. Ideally speaking, for a government to earn revenue, the sources should be limited to zakat, applicable at different rates, plus a land use tax, which can be used for infrastructure.
So why should governments, Islamic governments today, use this type of tax system, and will it work in practice? We know that most governments are reliant upon probably a lot more funding than they would be able to acquire through the type of system that you've proposed. How would this work in practice?
So some countries have actually done estimation. I would not say that they have implemented it. For instance, Malaysia, there was a study done that if zakat is today collected in the same way how it is prescribed, then it will generate a considerable revenue. And I estimated that this was about 70% of general sales tax collected at that time. So it was not an insignificant amount. And if you add other taxes, like as I said, land use tax, then I think it can further boost the government revenue. The rates itself, the rates on the zakat, which I mentioned, are not mentioned in Quran. So there is a degree of interpretation there based on what historical evidences we have received. But we know that this is mentioned as part of the Islamic belief. So I think the modern governments can look into zakat not in strictly the same sense it was in which we understand today, but also can interpret it as a modern taxation and take the spirit. The spirit is keep it low, keep it flat, do not make it too complicated, and then use land taxes to develop infrastructure. So if we follow that spirit, then I think we can come up with the more sort of practical solution to it. But if we, of course, if we follow the literal traditional framework, then we might be limited. For instance, Quran mentions certain areas on which zakat can be spent. Now, if we follow the conventional understanding, then there will be problems. But then scholars have done interpretation of it. For instance, leading Islamic scholar, Javed Ahmad-Ghamidi, who is now based in the US, has written about it, and he has argued that this clause in Quran about where zakat can be spent includes those people who collect tax, means entire government. So conventional understanding is that, zakat can only be spent by that particular department, like a zakat collecting department. But then the other interpretation is, the entire government is responsible for it. So in a way, the whole government can be applicable. Now, this may sound very, very unrealistic, but I think some empirical work is needed there, combining with the modern interpretations of zakat, which may lead to new insights about how the fiscal requirements of the government, a limited government, I would say, can be met. Obviously, if you expand the limits of the government, then that will be impossible. But the whole idea of using this framework is to introduce a divine limit, if you allow me to say that, on the size of the government.
I'm fascinated by this tax proposal that you've laid out in your book, and I'd love to see some countries test it out in practice. And your book is full of interesting ideas like this, so I'd really encourage our audience to check it out. But I just have one last question for you, and that's, what impact do you hope this book will have?
Well, I hope that the readers will find it insightful in terms of expanding their understanding of economic vision of Islam. And I hope that the readers will find that it's not about just Islamic banking and finance. Towards contemporary Islamic economics discussion has a focus that's much deeper and it's much larger. So if by reading the book you realize that the understanding and practice of Islamic principles does yield a comprehensive and practical economic system with details which can be elaborated, then I think this book will be successful.
Ali, thank you so much. I always learn so much speaking with you, and I really enjoyed your book. I encourage our audience to find your book, Islam and Economics, on Acton.org's bookshop or by searching for it on Amazon. Thanks for joining us today, Ali.
Thank you so much, Nathan. It was a pleasure talking to you again, and it also helped me in organizing my thoughts.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at actonline@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Gabriel Jaja.